Again, thank you for that, and I think your words couldn't be more timely given the challenges that our collective field is facing in the next 5 years with, kind of the convergence of AI and machine learning, quantum computing, and if you don't like cybersecurity today, the word on the street is you really won't like it in 5 years. So, we're going to talk for about the next hour, or a little less actually, on a series of different topics. I thought, I'm not going to read the bios. I do encourage each of my colleagues up here to spend about 30 seconds explaining your agency, your role in that agency, and before you answer the questions I'm going to ask you, just so we can have a better idea. The bios are supposedly online. I couldn't find them. But I'm going to start off with Deputy Minister Greta Monika Tučkutė, and she said I can call her Greta after trying her name for the first time. But if you could please just introduce yourself and then let us know you're the Deputy Minister for Acquisitions and Cybersecurity Policy for Lithuania. What measures has your country implemented to build this trust and stability that we've been talking about, both domestically but also in your kind of global village and outside your bounds? And what are the main pillars of your strategy to increase the trust and resilience and so forth?
Thank you, Mark. First of all, let me express my pleasure being here. And thank you, Sebastian, for great organization of this event. I think really it's very timely to speak about all the cybersecurity and defense issues, challenges, and how we see the way forward. I think what has already been said, it's very important because indeed it's very complex, and we need to find the best way forward, how we move forward. Because it's not enough just to say that, okay, we need to have interoperability, but how we achieve this interoperability? Because each of us, we are very different, and our security requirements are very different. And each country is dictating different profile, different attitude, and different vision. So let me start then with myself. I represent here Ministry of Defense as a Deputy Minister of Defense of Lithuania. So us, we are a frontier country of the European Union, of NATO, and therefore for us it's very important to understand how we can secure ourselves well, because our threats, they come from the east, from the side of Russia and Belarus. We are experiencing constantly the cyber attacks, different challenges on our networks, on our critical infrastructure. And for us, it's really very important currently to understand how the best to secure all of these most important cyber infrastructure components of our country, so that our lives would not stop functioning just because of some really careless caring of our cyber the whole domestic infrastructure and what we have in our place. So in Lithuania, Ministry of Defense is the most important player that is dictating the cyber policy requirements, that is setting the policy forward, and also that is operationally securing the cyber security of all the most important institutions. Of course, all the institutions, they need to have also certain security elements in place so that they would be responsible for themselves. So here, I think the role of government is very important, because the government needs to understand how they set those requirements, what kind of vision it has forward, and with what kind of partners and allies it is setting this agenda. Because in cyber, we all know it's not possible to have frontiers. We cannot have physical security. We have to have a really very strong cooperation together with our partners, so that we would understand how we can enhance our cyber security altogether. And therefore, I think the role of government is very important, because government needs to understand what kind of parameters are the correct ones, what kind of certificates could be in place, and how we determine which is good or wrong, and what kind of, let's say, cyber response teams can be in place, and how we can react towards the incidents that are happening. So this is one component that I would like to elaborate in this presentation. Secondly, what is important is private and public sector cooperation. Because without private sector, the state cannot do anything. Because you have the competences, you have the skills, you develop very quickly, you can adapt quickly, and that's why the private sector is an important element in our stronger cyber defense ecosystem. Also, I would like to add here academia and young generation that we can have as staff, as people who can contribute to the cyber defense. And this is why we need to engage from very early stages with the high schools, with universities, and to have the best minds recruited for our sake, so that they would not go the other direction with the potential adversaries. And then the third component, as I was mentioning before in between the lines, is the cooperation with the international cooperation. So Lithuania, as quite a small country, is trying to engage into cooperation within the European Union. We have, for instance, Cyber Rapid Response Team that is reacting, and which is a PESCO project, which is uniting 8 member states of the European Union, and still inviting some other European member states to join this kind of initiative. And that is helping the European Union members to react to the cyber incidents, but also to the partners of the European Union. For instance, we were helping to Mozambique, or we were helping to Moldova when there is a requirements for the reaction and for helping to control the cyber incident. This kind of project has those capabilities to react. Also, Asia-Pacific component. I think it's important to understand not only how within the European Union we're working together, but also globally how we interact together. And we can learn very easily from each other, because cyber is something that is developing every day, and it's not enough to set some standards today and not to look what is happening in place every day, because it's evolving, it's changing every day. And for instance, Lithuania has this regional cyber defense center where we are cooperating together with Japan, we are cooperating with Australia, we are cooperating with Ukraine, and this provides us with very wide scope geography, but also very wide scope competencies that we can use all together. For instance, just recently we were organizing Cyber Champions event, where we had participants coming from Asia Pacific, from Europe, from United States, and this is where we can meet and speak in very professional environment about cyber challenges and how we can enhance our resilience in cyber altogether. So I think I will stop here at this moment, and
okay, well, you answered all 5 questions I had for you,
okay,
so
sorry,
you can sit
Marc.
down now. No, I'm kidding.
Thanks a lot.
No, that was great. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more about the private sector being of utmost importance in our country, and I think in in the United States and a lot of other countries, most of the critical infrastructure is housed in the private sector. So if you don't have the private sector on board, you just don't have security. Let's move to the White House next to Assistant Director for National Cyber Director at the White House, Phil Stupak. So, Phil, I think we talked about this last night at the reception. We know cyberspace has no international borders, but countries certainly do. To achieve trust and stability in cyberspace, it seems to make sense that it would run better if nations kind of agreed to a common set of rules or norms, and that we could hold accountable those that operated outside those norms. Is that something that you're involved in, working out on an international level or domestically?
Yes, so let me first say thank you very much to Sebastian. Thank you for the Paris Cyber Summit for having us all here today. And let me also say initially, our thoughts are certainly with our Ukrainian colleagues and the Ukrainian people. Today, in particular, the news that we have received this morning is just devastating. But this goes directly to your question, Mark, about how do we start thinking about global responsible behavior within this space. For the last 20, 30 years, we have been working on global norms for cybersecurity. We still do not have completely agreed global norms on cybersecurity, but what we are beginning to see is a coalition of those who are responsible within the space acting in a similar fashion. And I think that this is going to become the bedrock on which we are going to base responsible behavior. It is unlikely that we are going to go to the UN and have complete unanimous agreement on what global norms should be. But what we can say is that we can look at critical infrastructure and say you should not destroy critical infrastructure that's going to harm civilians. You should not engage in criminal activity across the globe. And when you do these things, it is the responsibility for those of us who would seek a more secure world to work together to find appropriate response. We can jointly investigate, we can jointly name and shame, we can jointly use all of our government powers to respond when these maybe not norms but sub-norms have been violated. And I think we've seen a great example of this coming from the counter-ransomware initiative led by the National Security Council and Neuberger, who we work closely with, has done a fantastic job in bringing together like-minded nations who can jointly say, you know, this ransomware problem that we have, these criminal actors that we have right now, are a systemic problem to global stability. And how can we investigate? How can we jointly share information? And how can we do joint takedowns? Very recently, we had a takedown of the Hive syndicate, where the United States played a leading role because they were on our soil. So we certainly see that there are areas of cooperation, and I think this is what's becoming interesting is that while we have had the academic conversation around norms, what we are seeing is that we are using an operational approach to cybersecurity that is establishing baselines, and it's on these these operational baselines that we can build a more secure future because we're all operating on the same platforms. We're all operating on the same software. We all have the same vulnerabilities. And so when we find ways to improve the overall security for one of us, it improves the overall security for all of us. We just released a new national cybersecurity strategy back on May 2nd. Like all good cybersecurity strategies, it has a bunch of pillars in it. Initially, we tried doing one without pillars, but of course, we came back to pillars. But our last pillar, Pillar 5, is on international cooperation. And I can tell you that until one of the very last drafts of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, we did not have an international pillar in it. That's not because we found international to be unimportant to the strategy, but because we saw an international component in every pillar of our strategy. Every piece of what we are trying to do to defend critical infrastructure, everything of what we're doing to dismantle our adversaries, everything that we're doing within the marketplace, and of course with building the future that we want is connected to our international partners. We did eventually put in that international pillar only because it is an API for the State Department, who will be drafting their own international cybersecurity strategy to connect back into our strategy. But the point, just to bring it back to your initial question, I think that we are seeing the emergence of subnorms. We are seeing responsible behaviors that we can all agree to, and we're seeing coalitions of those who want to have a better world in which we can all thrive within cyberspace.
Thanks, and I have some questions a little later on in this session to get into what steps we can collectively take when nations operate outside those norms. For now, could you please just spend about 30 seconds on your organization? It's somewhat new, and then what your background is.
Yeah, wonderful. So yes, I'm the Assistant National Cyber Director for International at the new Office of the National Cyber Director. The Office of the National Cyber Director was created by Congress in December 2020. So this is the very first office that we've had for this role. Our purpose is to build cohesion across the federal government so that we are all acting in a similar direction. Our acting director likes to say that it's like a symphony, right? Where we have all the different parts of the symphony playing across the federal government, and if we don't have a conductor, it's just noise. So our role is to try and make music from all the capabilities across the government. My particular role is to do that with our international partners.
All right, thanks. And next we'll go to John Carlin, who's currently co-chair of Data and Security for Paul Weiss, but he's also a former senior Justice Department executive. In fact, I realized I didn't go first. So I worked with John at the Department of Justice for several years on the national security side. And then before Phil got to the White House, I was at the National Security Council working on cyber and counterterrorism and other issues in the Strategic Comms Office. John, so let's go from saying the things that we should to what the things that are. Can you provide some of your insights from your experience both in and out of government on how these public-private partnerships can be leveraged, like an example of how they can be leveraged to build the trust and stability, and maybe highlight one that you think is particularly good for this audience?
Thanks, Mark, and I want to echo the thank you to Sebastian, and so grateful to have the opportunity to participate in this Paris Cyber Summit. It's a critical time, and I think it's a time to echo the opening remarks where we're at a crossroads, where there are different visions of what cybersecurity might look like going forward. One vision, and it is particularly trumpeted by Russia, China, different degree, Iran, North Korea, is a vision where the key to security is control within each nation and an absence of sharing both information, so no free flow of data, and security practice. And at the same time, a competing vision that says for like-minded nations, if you share values, if you share legal controls, if you share an approach to rule of law, that we want to be able to share information, and that sharing information rapidly and at the speed of the threat is what's critical to counter the threat, is what's best ultimately for security. For this idea that to counter collective threats, we need to be able to share information quickly and across country boundaries is one that was deeply informed by our joint fight against international terrorism, against the trafficking of children across borders, against the flow of international narcotics and cartels that also cross borders. So both when I was served as Chief of Staff at the FBI and when I headed national security for the Justice Department, as we were evolving to face these transnational threats, a premium was placed on working closely with allies in France and across the EU at sharing information so that we could combat threats jointly, as we realized that traditional physical boundaries were not sufficient to protect our respective citizens, but that to combat these threats where the threat actor, the bad guy, was working across nation-state boundaries without regard to sovereignty, that we had to both respect sovereignty but figure out a way to work collectively as like-minded nations. That's never been more important than when it comes to the cyber threat, because fundamentally, if you think about the shift that we've undergone, we moved almost everything we value from analog, from books and papers, to digital, to bits and bytes, in a remarkably short period of time, 30-something years. And then we connected that through a protocol, TCP/IP, that was never designed with security in mind. In fact, when I took a step out of government, wrote a book on cybersecurity and the battle against particularly China and Russia, and I interviewed those who created the internet and discussed with them the quite conscious choice they made for this protocol to place a premium on communication and not security. So if that protocol is fundamentally insecure, then a cornerstone of our collective strategy can't just be on the defensive side. It has to be going after the bad guys, those who do not abide by global norms. And I'll say those 4 countries again: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea in particular, because cybercrime doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from people behind keyboards. And so those 4 countries, but also transnational criminal groups. So when I'm dealing now in the private sector, and when I did at the Justice Department, working with victims at companies, we're seeing increasingly what companies have faced is the so-called blended threat. So organized criminal groups who are provided safe haven, often in one of those countries, in a place that does not abide by the Budapest Cyber Convention, that does not enforce laws against criminal behavior. And so it's in that context, Marc, referring to your question, where we see what public-private cooperation looks like. And that's become, in the United States, sometimes people say public-private so often, it's become almost a joke. It's become empty of meaning. So to get more concrete, what I'm talking here is being able to share operational information at the speed and scale of a cyber threat so that you can take concrete action to cause pain or difficulty to the adversary that's trying to attack us collectively. I'll use an example of Hive, this takedown. So this is, like all of the threats in this area, these are organized criminal groups that increasingly operate like a software as a service model. They, again, don't respect nation states, so they work across borders themselves, sharing information, tools that are used for attacks, and they're increasingly segmented. So in order to be an effective criminal today, you can go on essentially the Amazon for crooks. You go and search through the website for the attack that you want to take. And then when I call it Amazon for crooks, I mean it has customer reviews. And so you'll see 5 stars. This tool for a cyber attack was quite effective. I strongly recommend you use this criminal. Or the ones I always like the best, they'll say 1 star, this was terrible service. This crook turned out that you can't trust them. Thinking, what did you expect? This is Amazon for crooks. They're not usually that trustworthy. In fact, one of the cases we brought at the Department of Justice was against a group called In Fraud We Trust. And the way we were able to disrupt the group is it turns out they should not have trusted each other because one of them was a police informant who helped to disrupt the group. Hive is an example of the shift that we took under the Biden administration, working closely with partners around the world, where we said, in order to get victims to come forward to share information voluntarily, we need to show concrete results. And that result can't be re-victimizing the victim and saying it's your fault that you got hacked by a sophisticated Russian-funded criminal group, but instead that by sharing information, we're able to take action to protect you. So that means, 1, working with countries around the world, Lithuania, France, others, so that when someone travels to a country that shares values, that you can arrest the person, that you can share evidence at that speed and arrest the individual. So there's a real consequence to having been behind the keyboard and perpetrating the attack. But recognizing there are safe haven countries and the criminal justice system is not sufficient to stop this problem. Number two, what else can we do to disrupt the digital ecosystem that makes it so efficient for the criminals to work together? We can do things like, when it comes to cryptocurrency, to digital currency, the blockchain provides advantages to the criminals, and we see this with the extortion cases, but it also provides a degree of transparency to those in law enforcement who want to disrupt the operation. So for the first time, you saw publicly, and now you've seen it repeated, this approach of they want the money, that's why they're attacking us and our companies and us as citizens. So if we can't arrest them, why don't we go after the digital wallet? And you saw that with the Russian group who attacked Colonial Pipeline inside the United States. This was a group that was named Are Evil. So if you're wondering, are they good or are they bad? They gave you a hint with their name, Are Evil. They probably are evil. They attacked Colonial Pipeline, and one of the remedies was couldn't get the individuals, it's a Russian-linked gang, but you could get the proceeds. And so essentially using lawful process, we hacked the hacker, took the money that was in the digital wallet and returned it to the victim. In other instances, when you can't get the return of the money through the digital wallet, you can disrupt it. If the bad guys can't make money here, they'll go somewhere else. The reason why they're doing these extortion or ransomware, and we've seen the growth, is because of the money. Number two, Hive is a good example. Another use of legal process working across jurisdictional boundaries, so with like-minded countries, sharing information and then being able to act under the law. In that instance, they were able to hack the hacker and steal the code that was used to encrypt systems. So you think of ransomware as a code that encrypts your system so you're unable to gain access to your information. This is an instance where secretly they stole the key, and for about 9 months, if a company came forward to ask and say they'd been the victim of this attack, they were secretly provided the key. The bad guys did not know they had lost the key, and so they couldn't figure out why they were making no money from this ransomware event until about 9 months in. Working with the private sector, they both announced arrest warrants, seized currency, but also disrupted the digital platforms that were being used to conduct the attack. Number three of this joint approach, again using lawful process, is working with private partners to figure out what vulnerabilities are being exploited. Are there backdoors on computers across the world? Because these are always, again, don't respect boundaries, the criminals. And push a patch. So for those who are unable to do the patch on their own, to push a patch that closed the back door so that once the criminal group was disrupted, another group couldn't take advantage of that same closed door. They just closed and turn it to you. So these are real cases happening now. I can say in my current practice working with victims, it's changing the calculus and causing victims to come forward on their own because they're seeing when we come forward, there's something that governments can do, when for a while they thought this is just a hopeless problem. But the last, and I know it's going to be, has been a theme so far of remarks, which is this approach will not work if people believe incorrectly that security for a problem that's fundamentally international in scale is to go it alone. So the more we try to model ourselves after a Russia or China, where we don't share information across country borders, where we don't allow companies to operate across country borders, where we don't allow law enforcement with like-minded countries to discuss and share information, the less safe we will be, because our adversaries, the criminal groups, they are working across borders.
Thanks, John. And just for our AWS friends here, I just want to do a little note. There's not actually an Amazon for crooks. That was just an analogy. That is not a service they offer, but it's, thank you for that. Oliver, let's go to you next. Remember to please introduce yourself and your organization. And I want to change gears just a little bit from the private sector. I'd like to get your thoughts, and then I'm going to ask the question again and expand it to the rest of the panel about these regulations and policies and procedures we're talking about the government, making and having. How, from the private sector, how can we do that and be complementary to business and not throw blocks in their way? And also, I'll get to the larger group to get their thoughts. The speed of technology advancement and certainly threat generation oftentimes, believe it or not, exceeds the policy process in governments. So how can the government be a good partner to the private sector while not ending up with policy and implementation that's already outdated? Why don't you start with that, and then we'll go to some others.
Thanks. So thank you for giving the opportunity to speak today. I'm Olivier Dellenbach, and I'm the CEO of ChapsVision and president of the GICAT data cluster, who regroups all the tech companies dedicated to data management. So to answer to your question, I mean, I'm always a bit skeptical personally about regulation and policy. I mean, as an European, we absolutely usually do love bureaucracy and regulation, but in this particular case, I'm not so sure it is that efficient. We are fighting against people who do not respect the rules. So, for example, I mean, I'm always passionate about seeing Europe banning some technologies while the people in front of you are using them massively. I mean, there are big debates about AI right now in Europe, as you know. There are big debates about facial recognition, biometric imprint, which are completely forbidden in France, for example. While we know there are very good technology to actually help us fighting against our enemies. So at the end of the day, I mean, regulation in a very fast-moving world is always a question mark, and I'm always a bit skeptical about its value going forward.
Okay, so what we see is a skeptical there, but for our government and former government friends here, look, we're going to have government roles in cyber and in cybersecurity and in data security, and so how can we, do you have a thought that you can share on how that can be done in a complementary process in both not to really trip up business doing what they do, which is to do business, but also just keeping up, making sure that the standards that you're executing, or the policy or the strategy that you're executing is not already outdated by the time you start the execution.
Maybe I'll jump in first, Marc.
Sure.
So the United States has historically taken more of a voluntary approach to regulation, especially within this field, because we value the innovative products that we have seen over the past 30, 40 years. However, this perhaps makes some sense, because when you have emerging technologies, the law is typically a lagging indicator to where society is as a whole. The law is very rarely a leading indicator to where we are. That being said, again, I'll go back to our national strategy that we just released. We recognize two fundamental shifts. I would like to talk about the first one, which is that perhaps we do need regulation within this space. Maybe even a year ago, if you had an American on the stage here, you would not have heard those words come out of their mouth. But we are, in fact, looking for how can we better regulate under-regulated sectors. We have a sectoral approach, and those areas that have not traditionally taken cybersecurity standards seriously, that they have not put them into practice, we are taking a stronger regulatory approach. I'm thinking immediately of our water treatment facilities, for example. The same week that we released our strategy, the Environmental Protection Agency released the first cybersecurity standards for water treatment facilities. So this will not work if we are doing it without our private sector colleagues. This just doesn't work. Instead, what we are looking for is how can we discuss what are the outputs that we want to see which is a more secure, better, defensible world, more resilient systems, and work directly with our private sector colleagues to determine how do you think we should go about doing this. We often see eye to eye, 90% of the time. Often one of the biggest complaints that we hear from the private sector is not that we're regulating. It's that everyone is regulating them in the exact same manner, but on different forms, right? So there's a regulatory harmonization piece that we're putting in place as well. And I see that as a fairly large carrot. If we can tell our private sector colleagues, well, guess what? We are going to regulate you a little bit more, but in exchange, you're only going to have to do it once. That alone saves tens of thousands of man-hours a year. So I think there is a way to do this wise. We should probably not regulate brand new technologies immediately on the day they're released, rather see how they develop. We need to work with our private sector colleagues to determine the best way to achieve the outcomes that we want to see. And then we also have to recognize the burden that we do put on industry when we regulate them and find ways to minimize that burden. So again, they can do what they do well and we can do what we do well without forcing the other one to do too much.
Minister, I think you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah. Does it work? Yeah, okay. So I absolutely agree that regulation is a bad thing, although I represent here government. Because yes, when you regulate too much, then you cannot be in the same pace competing with your potential adversary, because you cannot adapt to the given challenges. But on the other hand, we need to regulate in some way. So what is the best way to regulate? And for instance, I can bring up here an example, how we in Lithuania regulate IT equipment that is procured for the strategic companies or institutions. When we procure some equipment that is IT equipment, we need to ask for the providers details, so that we would avoid to procure from Russia, China, and Belarus. So why we do that? Because in that equipment, IT equipment, there could be some, something installed that could pose some threat to our infrastructure. But what we noticed, that the whole procurement process took too long. And then the companies that were procuring, they were trying to somehow, go around those requirements and to procure only from certain companies. And in this way, the competition would be disturbed. So what we are doing now is that we are trying to look at the whole process and to understand how better to do that. Maybe it's better to have some white list of companies that could be listed in that procurement list and from which we can procure, and in this way it would make faster our process. So what I mean with this example, that sometimes maybe when we are regulating, it's better to have less restrictions, but maybe to have better some certificates, maybe some white lists. And I totally agree that there should be harmonization of the whole legal framework. And I think here we can speak about European Union role, how European Union is trying to harmonize the whole legal framework and this NIS directive that is on the way now in all the European Union member states, that we need to implement and to embed in our legal system. I think this is something that helps for all the member states to have the same standards in place, so that we would speak in the same voice and we would not invent some new things, and instead we would have something harmonized. So I think, yes, indeed, we are somewhere on the good path, but we still need to improve it so that we would not restrict too much our private sector partners, and we would be able to compete with our potential adversary.
Thanks. John, do you have anything to add, or you want to just go on?
Just that couldn't agree with Greta more. If the public policy goal of the EU and transatlantic partners is to create jobs for lawyers, then having one that is not harmonized is terrific. And I say this as a statement against interest because right now, in the United States in particular, all 50 of our different states have different rules when it comes to privacy, which is great full-time employment for me and for others in this field, but seems like terrible public policy. So as we are looking to harmonization, there's both harmonization within the EU, and hopefully as we tackle these collective problems from we won't repeat the mistakes of the past, but we'll have transatlantic discussions as well, along with other like-minded countries, Australia, Canada, so that we are presenting again a front of harmonized procedures for those who share values so that we are stronger collectively. It's never been more important with the tragic events that we're seeing just even today with Russian aggression in Ukraine, that we're able to share data and innovate and use our strength, which is trust and sharing of common values when you have like-minded systems. And right now, I think it's particularly important in two areas. So one is in AI, we're unlikely to, if we want to innovate, we need to have probably a framework approach in place that builds ways so that the companies innovating in this space calculate risk, and that framework be, again, across borders and thoughtfully put out. It's the rare instance, and curious on the view, where
and that is my next question, so I don't want to cut you off, but let me cut you off. And Oliver, I'm going to go to you and have you lead this one. So we know your position on regulations and regulatory processes. You're not a big fan. A lot of folks in the private sector aren't. Do you feel that same way, where what we have coming down the technological highway towards us is AI, is machine learning, is quantum computing? What's your position? And then I want to move to the rest of our government attendees, and John, with your experience, and Amanda, certainly. Should we just let the Wild West prevail? Are you saying that we shouldn't have any interaction or any concern by governments to look at these new technologies and say, well, maybe we should look at them with an eye towards security instead of just doing what we usually do and bolt on security after it's broke? I mean, we wouldn't buy a car that when the version 1 tires pop off when you drive down the street. Why should we accept a technology, whether hardware, software, what have you, that is not secure, and the response from the manufacturer is, oh, we'll patch it?
I mean, I have two comments. The first one is, I love about regulatory constraints is that applied to at the same level to each countries, right? I mean, our friends of the United States obviously do not have necessarily the same relation with constraints and regulations that we have in Europe. There are plenty of things which are allowed in the US. From a security standpoint, we are illegal in Europe. So we don't have the same relationship with this. So that's the first thing. On the technology side, I'm fascinated to hear right now big firms, industry leaders, companies saying we have to slow down AI, right? Usually when I hear that from leaders, I just understand that, look, I translate this into, look, I'm probably too late for those technologies. The market will be taken by other firms. The only way to stop this is to add some regulatory constraints that will block the market, right? So technology cannot be blocked. I mean, it's fair to be to build systems, and at some point of time, when they will become more and more mature, there will be put in place some constraints on it, right? But not in the first place. Look at, for example, what we are doing here again in Europe, Artificial Intelligence Act. It has started before ChapGPT arrived, right? And when ChapGPT arrived, it was already completely outdated, right? And they have to think about it again,
exactly.
Right? So the problem with technology right now, it's moving too fast. So every time you put some constraint on it, more or less, you will slow down your competitive advantage, right? And at this, from a technology standpoint, we are speaking about competition, right? We are competing against, I mean, Europe is competing against US, US is competing against Europe, we are competing against the rest of the planet. This is a reality, right? So the only way to fight against the competition is not, I mean, to shoot in our foot and saying, look, let's stop, let's freeze. I mean, frankly speaking, every time someone is asking me, do you believe we should slow down AI? I say, absolutely, in the US, so that Europe can catch up.
That's good. And I want to get into the competition thing in a subsequent question, because I understand, rules that follow, or nations that follow the rule of law don't mind competing. They mind competing against countries that don't follow the rule of law and have unfair advantages. We'll get to a question there later, but Minister, you have a...
Just a short remark. You were saying that technology is moving too fast, but maybe bureaucracy is too slow. So, as always, because bureaucracy, it's the nature of bureaucracy to be slow and to be like kind of elaborating the ideas, taking their time. And but I think in current time we need to be faster as well from the point of bureaucracy. And here it's again, I would my vision would be it's not the through very strict regulation, but through declaration of the certified and whitelist providers that we could be faster, because this is something that would allow our public sector, for instance, to have in place the list of good companies that we can use, for instance. And in this way, we are quite fast to react, and we don't restrict too much our potential private sector partners. I don't know, maybe there are some other solutions, but you are right that in regards of artificial intelligence, till we were working on this act, it got old. So it's difficult to catch up, because there are too many stakeholders among whom we need to agree. So by doing something like, instead of regulating, but providing somebody, some kind of list or some kind of possibility to check with some, I don't know, possible private sector participants and companies where you can provide from, then you, in some way you regulate, but non-regulating. I don't know, it's just an idea.
But look, in Italy, for example, they have decided to ban ChapsGPT. I can tell you that the only thing that will come out of this is there will be absolutely no tech company in the AI and generative AI in Italy, right? So is it really good for Italy? I don't believe. It's much better to have an ecosystem of open source companies who try to compete against ChapsGPT than just to say we are not allowed to do it. So let's do something else.
But then if you have this open source companies, I don't know, a list of companies that are participating, and you can have some kind of look at those companies, what kind of product they are providing, then the state can participate as well. And then in a way also to regulate by giving possibility to them, for them to develop or not giving, like saying if it is a company coming from Russia, let's say in Lithuania case, we would say, no, this kind of company, it's not in our interest that we would procure from this kind of company, because we have very clear law that is saying that we cannot procure from Russia-based or a company that is established by a Russian. So I think there are some certain modalities that we can apply by regulating, but not in that strict sense.
So Amanda, do you have anything, I mean, as a person whose company is heavily involved in moving the ball forward on AI, do you have anything to add to this question? I don't want to put you on the spot. But if,
Sharing, thank you. No, I think similar principles apply to how we should be approaching AI technology, to how we're thinking about cybersecurity more broadly, and particularly security of AI technology. I mean, I think from my perspective, as others here have acknowledged, there is a space for regulation to have a strong impact. I think one of the challenges is that we should be thoughtful about what we're trying to achieve with that regulation. Are we actually going to be able to address all of our concerns through regulation? No, probably not, in order to have a streamlined, agile sort of regulatory approach, right? So we have what we can achieve with a regulatory approach, and then we need to think about other ways that we are working together to manage risk, right? So that's one approach, just constraining, like, what are we actually trying to achieve through regulation. As we go forward with actually building that regulation, I think very important to have an agile sort of process for evolving the security requirements, for taking into account technology changes that are going to occur. And that's, you know, I'm with whichever speaker it was who said, you know, public-private partnership seems like a very overplayed term. I am very receptive to that, and I understand that too. But I have seen it work as well, right, where you have close collaboration on the evolution of security requirements, and it's so much better when you have a kind of dedicated forum to engaging in an ongoing way on how things need to evolve, because you kind of have that sort of, you have that shared trust as a group, you understand where people are coming from, you know that everyone is actually trying to achieve the shared outcome, but you have different perspectives that are really important for understanding what the impact is going to be for a certain approach to a requirement, or what the impact is of a requirement that works today, but because technology is changing, it won't work tomorrow, right? And so having that kind of process is really, really, really important. And then the third piece that I think about, again, for AI and for security of technology kind of more broadly, is the challenge that we're all gonna have with the next phase, where we're, you know, I think we're seeing in cybersecurity regulation, I think we're gonna soon see in AI regulation, is, you know, trying to have a way of, again, measuring the implementation of those requirements, conformity assessments, certifications, other mechanisms. That's a place where we see, even if we've actually effectively developed a set of security requirements that are sufficiently agile and allowing for technology companies to evolve, oftentimes the conformance process does not maintain that same agility, because you have people in the role of doing those assessments, or, you know, having the certification that they manage, that are necessarily focused on a set of ways that an organization can prove conformance with a requirement. And they're not necessarily always given the latitude or have sufficient expertise to be able to really evolve how an organization could meet that requirement considering new technology. And so this is a space where I think we have a lot of challenges ahead. It's really important that we get it right. And we don't have as many of the partnerships in place to figure out how to do that. So it's an area of focus, I think, now in order to ready us for what's coming with AI.
thanks, Amanda. John, do you have anything to add, or? 'Cause if not,
Quickly, you know, one approach in this area is, and even Oliver, I think you will agree on this, which is that for those who are going to be consumers of, let's say, AI, or right now the particular generative AI that is popular, they are looking for guidance on risk-based approaches, and they want help with developing what the principles are, what should the rules be for their workforce, what should they think about in terms of the risks going forward if they adopt this new technology. That's an area where experts across the Atlantic could help formulate what those principles are, so that those companies can choose their own approach to risk. And that's a market-generated way, ultimately, of then, for the providers of those services, they're going to need to meet the demands of their customers. I know in my nonprofit hat working with the Aspen Institute, because we've just had so many questions from companies to try to come up with what those principles are. And in order to come up with the principles, we're working with governments and other members of the private sector. And it's hard because it forces you to confront the risk-based questions of, we see these incredible advantages. What we're having trouble with, and this is true with cybersecurity writ large, I think for many of my clients in the private sector, boards of large companies, they have trouble quantifying what the risks are so that they can make intelligent decisions on how to adopt the new technology. And that's an area where I think working together, that government working with those designing the technologies can help think ahead 10, 15 years as to what the risks may be so that people can make intelligent acquisitions now.
Thank you. All right, we're going to enter the speed round portion of the panel, where I'm going to ask a question, and then we'll go to each panelist, and you have about a minute and a half. Hopefully, we can be dynamic enough that people will put their iPhones away and listen. So what we see right now in the irresponsible nation category, you've mentioned 4 countries, so let's just flesh that out a little bit. We see Russia allowing criminal gangs to operate within their borders, attacking hospitals, schools, police stations, energy grids. We see, in fact, they're protected oftentimes by FSB and other Russian assets. We see China's military and intelligence services sealing unprecedented amounts of data, entire data sets, today, yesterday, tomorrow, from all of our countries. We see countries like North Korea using their hackers operating out of China and Russia to essentially steal banks. They're robbing massive amounts of cryptocurrency, and they're using money laundering to get the hard cash, and they use it for their WMD programs. And then they also use their assets to attack a film company that made a movie they didn't like about their dictator. We see Iran launching destructive attacks against its neighbor, Saudi Aramco, where it bricked thousands of computers. What can we do? What can nations who operate with these kind of norms that we talked about, what can we collectively do to send the message that, look, this is not going to be tolerated, or can we do nothing? Why don't we start with the minister?
I think there are quite a number of measures that we can do. First, don't buy anything from those countries. I mean, anything, it means software, it means IT equipment, it means everything that they are producing. Try to limit, because anything that when it comes to IT equipment or software, then you are catalyzing of course, this IT and cyber capabilities. But also, if you buy from them simple things, then you catalyze the economy. And then economy catalyzes the whole process I mean, feeds the people who are working in the...
So you're saying use market forces to punish them?
Yeah, use market forces. That's, thank you for summarizing. Then secondly, I think we need also to have our consolidated funds and activities, how we can join the forces and use the finances that we have. We have accelerators, we have EU money, we have NATO money for Diana, for instance, accelerator. We have already certain measures in place that help to combine and to put into place all those intelligent minds and see what kind of products we can produce all together. So this is the second one. Then we need to cooperate together.
Speed round.
Yeah, and then we need to cooperate, of course, and cooperate not only bilaterally, but also cooperate EU, US. Asia Pacific, EU, US. We need to have all those formats where we put money together, we put our intellect together, and we put together our efforts, and we find a solution. So it sounds very easy, but I know that's complicated. So.
No, it's fine. For the next two, I'd like for you to talk about what we're doing now from a policy, and then John, I would like you to hit on obviously you hit on all tools, but John, if you can give some granularity to the tools that you used in the past, and maybe the rationale behind why it matters indicting somebody if you can't readily get your hands on them. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I can do this real fast. So first, everything John said earlier is exactly right. When it comes to cyber criminals, this is how we're trying to disrupt and dismantle these criminal networks. When it comes to nation states, I think we look at the Countering Ransomware Initiative, where we can jointly prepare as nations. We can jointly prepare.
I need to say that Lithuania is also very actively participating
Yes,
in
you
this
are.
counter-ransom initiative.
The threat is right next door. Yeah. But we can jointly prepare, we can jointly respond, and then we can jointly impose costs. And this is the only way we're going to do this, right?
So talk about the all tools approach of imposing costs. So one, just to echo Greta and Phil, which is we need to allow information sharing and try to provide immunities for companies who share information in order to do attribution, because you need to figure out who did it, and we can figure out who did it together. Two, once you figure out who did it, then you need to impose costs. The all tools approach in the US government came from working with allies in the EU on other threats like terrorism. And the idea is don't leave any tool of national power off the table. So one, use, when appropriate, your national security tools, so collection of information through the military or others when you're confronting a nation-state cyber threat. And then you need to figure out ways to share that information cross borders with like-minded allies. Number two, use the criminal justice system, even if it's a nation-state actor. A case that I brought that was controversial at the time, but I hope has become more the norm, was in 2014, so about a decade ago, the first indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army. It was a unit, a specialized unit, Unit 61398. And what this unit did is they put on their uniform each day, they went behind the keyboard, and they targeted private companies inside Europe, inside the US, across the Asia Pacific. And they targeted those private companies not to collect information for the benefit of the state, but to steal secrets that could be used against them by competitors. To use one economic espionage case, they stole the formula of a titanium dioxide, which sounds like it might have some military application, but it actually was the formula used for the color white in Oreo cookies. And so that is not a nation-state secret inside, as delicious as the Oreo cookie can be, although I'm in France, so I recognize probably Oreo cookies are not high cuisine. But the idea is they just wanted to use it for commercial advantage. And so one of the reasons we brought the case, there's international common law. We have the same principle baked into US law, and this is the idea that if you allow someone to walk across your lawn, they get what's called an easement. They get the legal right to walk across your lawn. And that's why people put up no trespassing signs. Using your criminal justice system can be a very effective no trespassing sign. We don't accept the fact that you can use your military to steal things like the recipe for Oreo cookies and use them against us for commercial benefits. And by using our criminal justice systems together across countries, and this is the idea of the Budapest Convention, where we have similar laws in place, we can set the norms for the new world. 3, the use of sanctions. And this goes to Greta's point, but if there are nations who do not abide by these norms, then to say, if you will not abide by the norms of like-minded nations throughout the world, then you can't use joint trust mechanisms like currency for transactions. So to sanction actors, that group I mentioned earlier are evil. They are now sanctioned, which means if they extort in the United States, and for those using US currency, you can't make a ransomware payment. That would be in violation of the sanctioned regime. Finally, the Commerce Department, and this was new, export restrictions. This also goes, I think, to the points Greta and Phil made, that says if there's certain dual-use technology, you can't provide it to a country that's not accepting our norms and is using that for tools to support their military, to support these criminal organizations, or to support actions that are against human rights. None of these tools work effectively unilaterally. They very much require like-minded countries to use these tools collectively with joint attribution and a joint sense of what the norms are.
Thank you.
I agree, we need to collaborate more, but at the same time, not to be too naive too, right? I mean, it's not like there are two worlds, right? On one side, the evil, and on the other side, the good guys. Even within the good guys, there is competition, right? I believe we need to have our own each country, each continent should have its own capacity to protect their best interest. And from time to time, our best interests are not necessarily the US best interest. That's a fact. And I mean, cybersecurity is not against the evil, it's against sometimes our best friends too, just to protect our best interest, right? So I believe we need to develop in each country, in Europe in particular, our capacity to block, to protect, to respond to attacks wherever they come from. Obviously, the most dangerous coming from the evil side of the world, but from time to time from the good guys too, right?
Amanda, do you want to add anything to that? And then we're going to go to audience questions. So if there are, I notice microphones up here, so if you want to line up when you do ask a question, please just state your name, your organization, and what your question is and who it's to, please. But go ahead, Amanda.
Very briefly, I would just underline a couple of things that have been said. One, I think there has been incredible impact in driving that kind of conversation forward on norms of behavior and focusing on multilateral cooperation, on accountability, and kind of the joint statements that have been made in response to behavior that deviates from accepted norms, I think has been incredibly powerful in the last couple of years. The other thing that I would underline is the way that we can collaborate to really impose costs on bad actors through the operational collaboration that was mentioned. And this is something from a Microsoft perspective. We have our digital crimes unit that's very focused on these kinds of investigations from a Microsoft perspective, like protecting our own ecosystem, as well as looking more broadly at what we're seeing and how can we impose costs and drive down some of this bad behavior. We've seen incredible impact for that work in the last few years, really growing because of the kind of extensive partnerships that we're building with governments and with others in the private sector. Our most recent takedown, Cobalt Strike, was really like leveraging a lot of private sector partnerships as well, and that just really increases our scale and impact.
Thank you. All right, do we have any questions from the audience? I didn't see.
Hello.
Anyone? Come on, guys. All right, we get one back there.
I don't think, it is working, okay. So first, thank you to the panel, it's fantastic.
Sorry, name, organization, and question, and
Yes,
who it's
my name
posed
is
to.
Mitchell Belfer, I'm the president and founder of the Euro Gulf Information Center in Rome, Italy. My question is to Deputy Minister Tučkutė. I don't know the pronunciation, but you rightly said at the very beginning that Lithuania is a frontline state, and I think that the lessons learned by Lithuania in a long conflict, because it didn't just start now with the invasion of Ukraine, but with the 2007 cyber war that was launched by Russia against neighboring Estonia. So I'm wondering if we go back to the theme of the panel about trust, because Russia's goal is to erode trust in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, but also throughout Europe and the West. So what strategies have been developed by Lithuania that could be learned by others in rebuilding and consolidating that trust on a societal level so that those nefarious actors that are using cyberspace to erode trust can't win? That's my question. Thank you.
Can I take it now, or should I? Thank you very much for the question, and that's very indeed the truth. Lithuania experienced and is experiencing Russia's presence just around the corner, I would say. And for us, it's very important, first of all, to have our cybersecurity and critical infrastructure in place very well secured. So we're putting all the efforts from the governmental side so that these standards would be high and adversary would not be able to breach the wall. Of course, we need to develop all the time and to learn good practices. We are learning, unfortunately, from Ukraine that Russia is waging on the war and waging war on Ukraine, and we're learning from Ukraine how Ukraine is responding to cyber threats and cyber attacks. As well, I think what is a very important component of being well secured in cyber domain is providing resilience of the people in general. It means teaching them the cyber hygiene, teaching the companies and private sector, like simple small companies that have small households, how to secure themselves through quite simple means, how to secure their websites, for instance, from DDoS attacks, how to have, what kind of instruments they should have in place, like a must-do list. So I think this is also very important. The role of the government is all the time to inform and educate your society so that this society would be more resilient and would be able to protect itself, not only waiting from the government to do that, but also themselves by themselves, having in mind that it's a must to have cyber software in place that would protect them from any of the attacks. So I think these are the most important lessons that we learned.
All right. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank the audience for listening to the panelists. We're about a minute away from a network break, so rather than hold up everybody with further questions, if you do have any questions, why don't you just mingle with the speakers while we're all at the networking break. Thank you very much.